Well, as I began to read some of these things, get excited about creation, here I was teaching at a Christian college, different than the one I am now, as I mentioned, but I decided, hey, it's time to tell my students about some of these things. Now, at Clearwater Christian, that's what we want. Teachers putting their faith into practice in the classroom. So I thought I'd try it here. And so I began to tell my students about the evidence of creation that we could see in the science classroom. Guess what happened? I got challenged to a debate. By whom? By members of the Bible department. Okay, at this particular Christian college, maybe I should put that in quotes now, the Bible department was teaching that the Old Testament was a collection of Babylonian myths and fables, and that Yahweh or Jehovah was a tribal war god of the Hebrew nation, bore no relationship at all to Jesus Christ, the God of love in the New Testament. Well, here I was in the science classes saying, no, this is a Word of God. You can believe every word from Genesis 1:1 right through clear to the end of Revelation. Well, that was too much for the Bible department. So they challenged me to a debate. Well, there were 3 of them and only 1 of me. Well, they didn't want me to have the underdog sympathy, so they said, you get some help. So I got the chemist and the biologist who'd help lead me to the Lord. So here was the great debate. The Bible department defending evolution, the science department defending creation. Okay. Well, after the great debate, nobody asked me questions about biology anymore. But some of my friends said, look, Parker, if you only knew something about fossils, then you'd give up this creation nonsense and come on into the 20th century with the rest of us. Well, about that time, the Lord did one of the nicest things He's ever done for me, a grant from the National Science Foundation to go back and work on my doctoral degree, updating a major in biology and adding a minor in geology, especially the study of fossils. It's the richest I've been in my life. I'd like to thank you, taxpayers, for your support. Now, at this time, I knew I was a Christian. I was pretty sure I was a creationist. But if the fossils didn't work out, I just wouldn't tell anybody about it. Sorry to say, I've never been a man of great courage. But as the Lord would have it, all of the things that I learned in graduate school working on my doctoral degree made it hard to believe in evolution, even though I was being taught by evolutionists. The science made it hard to believe in evolution, easy to believe what the Bible taught about creation, about the fall, about the flood, and about our salvation in Christ. One of the first courses I got into was a little bit of an aside, but according to the catalog, this is where I was going to learn about the origin of the universe, the Big Bang, and all that sort of thing. And so we got into the class, and the prof said, stellar evolution, the evolution of stars. He says, that's aging. That's aging. And the more I thought about it, I thought, that's evolution. Evolution is supposed to be things getting bigger and better, forming, coming into being, not wearing out. What we were studying was Hebrews 1, the heavens growing old and wearing out like a garment to be cast off. And he said that idea that the gas clouds condense to form stars, the nebular hypothesis, says there is a problem. Every time you do the calculation, the gas pressure pushing out is 60 to 100,000 times greater than the gravity pulling in. He laughed and said, maybe we should call it the nebulous hypothesis instead, meaning a fuzzy idea. And I thought, maybe that's not so challenging. And the rest of it was just fabulous exercise in descriptive astronomy and the wonders of God's world, as we saw Psalm 19 before our eyes, the heavens declaring the glory of God, the firmament showing His handiwork. Next class was in fossil plants. Got there right away, first thing on the front row, didn't want to miss a thing. The prof comes in fashionably late, and right up front he says, I suppose many of you are here to learn about the evolution of plants. He says, you aren't going to learn much. Charles Darwin wrote over a century and a quarter ago that the origin of flowering plants is, quote, an abominable mystery, unquote. He said, nothing's happened in the last century and a quarter to change that any. What you are going to find, he said, is that our modern plant groups go way back in the fossil record. And sure enough, there in Australia, you find some of the supposedly the oldest plants anywhere, these fabulous blue-green algae in the south and west of Australia. And never let anybody tell you these are simple plants. These blue-green algae can take seawater and turn it into life. There's no chemical company that can do anything like that. Biochemically, they're far more sophisticated than you and I. And guess what? Those same blue-green algae are doing exactly the same thing right off the shore where they find their fossils. What's the lesson? Evolution? Simple beginnings change from one kind to another? Not at all. Creation, complex beginnings, things created well-designed to multiply after their kind. There is a change. When you take a look at some of these plants, in fact, what we found out is there were more plants living in the past than there are at the present time. In some plants that only grow as big around as my finger nowadays, in the past grew as trees 120 feet tall. In a little scouring rush, horsetail, equisetum, that many of you know, a little sprig that grows about as big around as your finger, is found in fossils right around this area here. It's trees 50 and 60 feet tall. Not a record of upward, onward progress. It looked like things were well designed to multiply after their kind, and something happened that brought rack and ruin, a decline in size and variety. And the Bible tells us what that is, the fall and the flood. Professor Corner at Cambridge University summarized it in an interesting way. I had a chance to speak at Cambridge one time, and I wanted to meet Dr. Corner in person, but his students say that even though he believes in evolution, he believes in being honest with the evidence. And this is the way he put it, that I still think to the unprejudiced, even though he believes in evolution, if you just look at the fossils, I believe to the unprejudiced, the fossil record is in favor of special creation. Well, even for a man of small courage, that was kind of encouraging. Well, the next courses then were in animal fossils. And so I warned my wife, I was going to have to stay up late to catch up with all these geology majors and so on and so forth. And then I got into the class, and here we were talking about gastropods and cephalopods and pelecypods and amphipods and decapods and dodecapods and all these other pods biology is famous for. I was right at home. I already knew all of those words. They were the same words and terms we use to classify things living today. You should have seen those biology or geology majors staying up late at night complaining, why do you biologists make such big names for such little things? The reasons the names continued is what? It was the same thing. We were just studying petrified remains of things living on Earth at the present time. Hands up all those who ever wondered where clams came from. Let's hear it for clams. Hey, not bad. 2 or 3 people, one of whom's my wife. I'm going to tell you anyway. You dig all the way back down through the earth till you quit finding fossils, and guess what? Clams come from clams. In our Science Center back at Clearwater, we've got the oldest clams you can find on Earth right next to clam shells we pick up off the beach. And we love to let young people come to the Science Center, look at these things, and tell us what's evolution done to clams over what they say is the last 500 million years. They look at you, clams are clams are clams. Well, let's see. How many of you ever wondered where snails came from? Okay. Not a very curious group, are you? But you dig all the way back down to the bottom, you quit finding fossils. Sure enough, snails come from snails. The first snails we find, high-spired, low-spired, spiny, with and without spines, all those sorts of things and so on. And the same thing with corals, all the way back down. Clams come from clams, snails come from snails, corals come from corals. As my wife put it one time, the one thing you never find are what? Snams and clails and chlorals. Something to get all of those things mixed up like that. So again, this was, instead of making it hard to believe in the Bible, what I was learning about animal fossils was making it hard to believe in evolution, easy to believe what the Bible said about things created well-designed to multiply after kind, and a decline in size and variety that followed the fall and the flood. Well, then I got to stratigraphy, the course on rock layers. My last session today, I'll take you on a backpacking trip down into Grand Canyon, as I actually do with my students on occasion. It will take a close-up look at some of those rock layers. But there's an experiment my wife likes to do right there in the Science Center. She made up a little tube of plexiglass about so long and so on, with essentially sand, gravel, and clay in it, 3 different sizes of things. And we had a public school group at the Science Center one time, and my wife asked the young people, I think it was about grade 6, and she said, how long does it take for rocks to form layers? Hands go up all over the room. Millions of years, millions of years, millions of years. And so my wife says, well, in science, we like to check our ideas against our observations. So I've got some stuff here, and I'm going to turn this tube upside down, and you watch what happens. So she turns it upside down, all the stuff tumbles down through this 4 feet of water, and in about 20 seconds, you've got 3 layers of sand, gravel, and clay. And so she asked the students, how long did it take to form these 3 layers? Hands go up all over the room. Millions of years, millions of years, millions of years. Well, my wife is a patient woman. It's my job to train her in patience. And so she said to the students here, let me try that one more time. In science, we like to check our theories against our observations. So I'm going to turn it over again. When I say go, you see where the hands of the clock are, and I'll turn it over and we'll try it again. So she turns it over, and, go. All the stuff tumbles down through the rock layers like that. About 20 seconds later, here's these 3 layers. How long did that take, she said? Hands go up all over the room. Millions of years, millions of years, millions of years. And I have to admit, my wife and I have got so concerned and enthused about books for young people. And what a privilege it is to have all of those books out there on the table now. And I think it took me 3 years to change my thinking from evolution to creation. And I think one of the reasons is I had to unlearn all of the things that I thought I knew as a fact. And it's so important to me. One of the most important people on earth is a kindergarten teacher. The next most important is first grade, right on up the line. If we can get our young people thinking right, thinking from the foundations right, what's the scripture say? Making wise the simple. A little child can understand more about the nature of the universe if they understand those opening chapters of Genesis than a scientist with a string of degrees after his name. And we can keep them from having to go through what I had to go through, unlearning and relearning. It's real important to get those foundations established right from the word go. So when it came to those rock layers in the class, I thought that this might be some kind of a challenge here in this class. How long is it going to take to form rocks like this? We know by observation, and Ken showed you those slides there from Mount St. Helens. We know by direct observation in nature that huge numbers of finely laminated layers can form very, very quickly. Well, a prof knew that too, even though he believed in evolution, and they often say it's roughly an inch per million years of sediment and so on. He was talking about a layer of rock in class about so thick that it was supposed to involve 20 million years of evolution based on the little teeny microfossils inside. So I was just listening, taking notes on zoning rocks with conodonts, these microfossils. And then the prof stopped. He said, I followed this rock layer down the creek bed, and he said, here was a shellfish, a nautilus with a shell shaped like an ice cream cone, perched on its tip end through the whole 20 million years. I said, how could that happen? How could that animal perch on its tip end for 20 million years without falling over? And of course, if the rock had already hardened, it couldn't stab its way through there. He said, these things are a real mystery, and wrote the name polystratic fossil on the board. Fossils that cut through many rock layers. Well, these are found all over the place. They're especially common in coal deposits, where you may have a tree go right up through several coal seams, several layers of shale and things like that, and it's no more rotted at the top than it is at the bottom. And evolutionists are mystified by those things. Some evolutionists have admitted in print that implies rapid deposition of the whole thing. All of those rocks had to be deposited before any rotting had occurred in this particular tree. My wife found one of these in a coal seam in Australia. And so among the bags we brought back, she brought back a tree trunk. Our bags are always interesting to look at. Come back from their customs, usually they're just anxious to get us out of the country. They don't care about some of these things. And so these are especially common in coal. And we see how those form in Mount St. Helens. Of course, a lot of original work done there by a Christian geologist, Dr. Steve Austin. That Mount St. Helens video is phenomenal. Here, a wave of water produced by this mud flow into Spirit Lake sloshes up the side of a hill, sheer up to 864 feet. Shears off these trees right at root level, breaks off the branches, strips off the bark and the leaves. They float out in a massive log jam here. And then as they waterlog, they tilt and sink vertically at different levels into the sediment below. We can understand how these things can form rapidly. No one has ever proposed a way they can form slowly that matches the evidence that we see here. Same thing about caves. A lot, of course, in this part of the country. All of you have been to see caves and so on. By the way, last year I got to bring, all students are flocking down to Florida for spring break. I brought 13 students up to Indiana in April to go fossil hunting up in here, right on the Ohio border. And we stopped off in caves and so on and so forth. And you've seen these stalactites and stalagmites, and you hear these stories about hundreds of thousands of years of slow dripping and so on. We were talking about this at a meeting in Australia one time, and I was explaining, like there's a school down in Miami. There's a stalactite growing in the science lab about this long. Well, the school was only built 3 years. When they noticed that, it made you wonder what it was hanging on for those millions of years till they built the school. And there are a lot of these under the Lincoln Memorial and so on. And so we were talking about this in Australia. Now,